Music is deeply associated with memories. I'm sure everyone builds connections differently, but for me, there's no better way to call upon a vivid image in my mind than to hear a song. Some melodies bring up memories that are life-defining, really, setting you upon a certain path. And this wistful, lonely, and somewhat somber tune is, well, pretty much the reason I make video games. I was 9 years old when I first heard it, and I would listen to it on a practically daily basis for around 8 years after, because it is attached to the main menu of what I can only call my favorite game of all time: Evil Island's Curse of the Lost Soul. Not one of favorites, the favorite. Evil Islands impressed me so much that I just knew, whatever happens, I have to break into game development. I wanted to make games like this. It's difficult to pinpoint any particular single aspect of Evil Islands that made me so invested, not just in the game itself, but the choice of my future career. Was it the gameplay that blended tactical combat with stealth while wrapping it all in a classless RPG progression, allowing for a large variety of builds and playstyles? Or maybe the fantastic crafting system where you combine blueprints of items and spells together with materials and runes, resulting in an insane amount of creative equipment variations. Maybe it's the world, as beautiful and stunning as it is dangerous, accompanied by atmospheric music that just makes you want to stand still and listen to it. Or the intriguing storyline full of treachery and deceit, but also of memorable characters with incredible writing and some of the best, spot-on voice acting I have ever heard in video games.
Плотину надо поднять рычагом, я его дам. Канал нужно завалить камнем, камень я не дам.
Or maybe it was everything. From the villagers seemingly living their own day-to-day lives, to staying crouched minutes and minutes on end, waiting for an opportunity to crawl past an ogre that will kill you in one hit if noticed.
Да, понял. Да.
Whatever the reason, my numerous travels, my career, at the root of it all is this game. From making levels on various casual mobile titles to leading the design of entire games like Trials Rising or certain mandates of huge AAA endeavors like Watch Dogs Legion, it all goes back to this main menu of an interactive totem standing in the middle of beautiful scenery in a desolate land. And even though I always loved Evil Islands, it's not like it was ever perfect. The closer you get to the ending of the game, the more rushed it feels, with the final boss battle and cutscene following it being extremely underwhelming. By the third act, the careful and considerate enemy placement transforms into what can only be described as throwing a pile of units on maps in hopes of it all turning out fine. Amount of story quests goes from 43 on the first island to 17 on the second to 16 on third, with the pace of the narrative obviously increasingly speeding up as a result. Of course, the issue of a very strong and polished first half followed by segments which might pale in comparison is sadly nothing new for the video game medium. It happened often in the past and still regularly happens now. Sure, Evil Islands is creative and innovative, but the developers were scrambling to get the whole thing out of the door. This was an extremely difficult project for the people at Nival. Evil Islands is actually part of the same universe that was known in Russian-speaking countries as Allods, and internationally as Rage of Mages. If you haven't heard about those, we have already discussed Rage of Mages 1 and 2 alongside their history in other videos. Evil Islands itself started its life right after Nival released the first Allods in 1998, later getting the title Allods 3 Resurrection. The developers had some insanely ambitious plans for it. Obviously, a big part of those was the transition to 3D. While the early game's visuals might seem quite rudimentary, there was a huge focus on increasing the quality of the three-dimensional world and characters as much as possible. Just these work-in-progress screenshots from the late 1998, early 99 already look very impressive for their time. And it does feel like all the work put into the tech advancements as well as art style iterations has really paid off by the game's release across Russian-speaking territories in October 2000. It was legitimately one of the best-looking games of that era, even rivaling full-fledged action and adventure titles that, unlike Evil Islands, which had to account for a bird's-eye view, were always meant to be seen up close. Dynamic shadows, day-night cycle, variety of blood effects like splatters on hit, painting damaged body parts and spilling on the ground after death, footprints showing up on terrain and changing color when stepped on aforementioned blood spills, character morphing that depends on their attributes, both permanent and temporary, and the list is far from over. I don't think I will exaggerate if I say that Evil Islands was a true technological marvel. Of course, there was a reason behind such a big focus on the game's visuals: the global market. Locally, it wasn't that big of an issue, but internationally, players and critics would tend to be dismissive of the first two Rage of Mages titles based on visuals alone. So clearly, Nival wanted to make sure that anyone's first impressions that for obvious reasons are greatly influenced by how the game looks would be as striking as possible, that the final result would feel truly AAA. And you know what? I think it worked. Previously, we have already discussed Warcraft 3's announcement at the end of 1999, how it looked and played very differently in comparison to its release date, calling itself a role-playing strategy. Considering that Evil Islands would continue the Rage of Mages concept of blending RPG and strategy genres together, at the time Warcraft 3 could be called its closest competitor. And comparing early 2000s Warcraft 3 screenshots with Evil Islands ones of the same period, we can certainly say that Evil Islands wasn't given ground. Perhaps there wasn't a "oh my god, which game will look better" hype war going on. Again, Warcraft 3's profile is just so much higher regardless, but still, internationally Evil Islands was seen as an equal, which I think is a big win. Especially considering that it started retroactively affecting the standing of the original games. Even IGN, which was, let's just say, never kind to Rage of Mages, started calling them underrated. We all love to say that a game's looks don't matter as much as how it plays, but the reality is as such that visuals matter a lot for getting noticed and maintaining or even changing a reputation before gameplay can take care of the rest. And Nival's plans for the gameplay of Allods 3 were really something. While later on it had the possibility to take advantage of Blizzard's Genius RPS moniker to avoid contemplations on the nature of RTS and RPG blends, during the early stages of development, it seems that the team took the international feedback surrounding the mixed genres of Rage of Mages very close to heart. You might remember a lot of comments from English outlets focused on Rage of Mages not satisfying any fanbase since it doesn't have base building, tech trees, resource management required for RTSs, nor does it have choices, skill trees, build options required for RPGs. Now, putting aside how this feedback places arbitrary limits on the genres themselves, Nival clearly wanted to avoid it in this new 3D iteration, so they were planning to include, well, everything. Building up and upgrading the village, going into first-person view at any time for direct control, complex diplomacy and alert system that really changes up every mission depending on your actions, tons of perks for every character, no stores, everything you equip has to be constructed from resources you gather in the world. A complex weapon damage system where a mace would be extremely effective against chainmail but not as much against scale mail, promoting tons of minute strategic choices. Putting the loot you get from enemies into treasure chests you can bury to avoid item decay, enemies being able to smell you based on wind, horse riding, dual-wielding weapons, and the list just goes on. It's a lot. So it's no surprise then that the development of Alots 3 was really difficult. There were constant additions and changes to the project. New feature of critical class became a local inside meme as funny as it was frightening, as they would just appear so often. No vacations, no weekends. The team was crunching. Some members would not be able to keep up with that insane pace and leave, while new ones would take their place. The whole endeavor was held together only by the belief that in the end there would be a really great game. And yet, the project kept changing focus and directions. Some features were cut, new ones were being added. At some point, due to the success of Thief and Commandos, the team has made a full-on push towards stealth. But playtesters and people on expos had an innate desire to play the game like Diablo, so the developers started to increase the amount and viability of combat situations while trying to find a balance between the two paradigms so the game wouldn't transform into pure hack-and-slash action. As passionate as everyone was, based on the information I could find, I think it's safe to assume that the project could have easily turned into a disaster. If not for the new Western publisher from Germany, Ravensburger, which would release the game as part of their Fish Tank Interactive label. Rage of Mages 1 and 2 were published internationally by Monolith, but in 1999 the company decided to close down the publishing branch and focus on development. After signing the deal with Ravensburger, as a result of the collaboration, the team at Nival finally achieved a sense of clarity and certainty, what they should do and what they shouldn't. This didn't decrease the amount of work everyone had, it was still a very difficult project, but now there was a guiding light they could follow as the development started entering its home stretch. With the publisher change, the project got the name Evil Islands to avoid licensing issues, even though it takes place in the same world. But as it happens, locally the name Alots couldn't be used either, also due to licensing issues with the publisher of the first game, so as a result of an open competition, a new name was chosen. Проклятые Земли, directly translated as Cursed Lands. And honestly, this is a situation where I believe a new title is more fitting than calling the final product Alots 3 or Rage of Mages 3 would have been. The universe is the same, sure, and it's still a mix of role-playing and strategy elements, but the RPG progression paradigms were vastly different, while the strategy aspect is closer to the tactical genre than RTS, with Commandos obviously remaining a large inspiration. It's not the exact kind of gameplay one would expect from Alod's Rage of Mages branding, so a new title ensures the correct expectations are set up. Over the course of its development, alongside the paradigm shifts, Evil Islands would start to become a much more focused experience. No base building, no first-person view, that and tons of other features were removed, while others that were deemed more necessary for the experience found their way into the game. Numerous playtests, beta tests, and expo showings throughout the first half of the year 2000 would help Evil Islands find its footing and polish up the experience. And yet, despite all this, the damage from the troubled development has already been done. Nival had to scramble to put everything together by its release date, which kept being pushed back. Alots 3 was supposed to be released at the end of 1999, after the name change the release got pushed to August 2000, then to September, and honestly speaking from experience, there is nothing worse than a chain of short delays, it just keeps everyone on edge. But at the end of October, the game was finally released. Of course, being 9 years old, I didn't know anything about the team's internal struggles at the time. I would just keep waiting for the release day. Not only because I was a fan of the Rage of Mages series and obviously wanted a sequel, but also because that summer an Evil Islands demo version was uploaded online, which I would just play over and over again. Until finally, thanks to my parents, the licensed 2CD jewel casebox got into my hands. And the licensed aspect was really important because piracy was rampant during those times and actually seen as quite standard in our regions. Nowadays, of course, the most straightforward way to buy the game is from GOG, though it should be noted that for some reason it comes with a bunch of messed up values in the registry. Some of the issues caused by that are obvious. Camera pitch control is impossibly fast and the shadows are missing even when they're turned on in the settings. It's easy enough to find fixes for that on GOG forums, but actually there are far more differences that affect the visuals too. Here is a direct comparison between the game with its GOG registry values and the original ones. I have uploaded a fix, all instructions how to apply it are in the video description. Now, I should note that the English translation of the game is not that great. The text is fine enough, I guess. It delivers the meaning of words, though very often the flavor found in the variety of character personalities is lost. Sometimes several sentences are just truncated into one, the most egregious example being the speech of the main character at the very beginning. Here's how it sounds in the Russian version.
Великие силы, как же мне больно. Словно молотом по голове ударили. Что же со мной случилось-то, а? И что это за место? Я не помню этих развалин. Проклятие! Да что там развалины? Я своего имени вспомнить не могу. Что же делать? Куда мне идти? Наверное, мне надо попытаться найти людей, которые живут здесь. А вдруг найдется кто-то, кто сумеет мне помочь?
And this is the same speech in the English version.
I woke up and could not remember anything.
To be fair, this is literally the worst case scenario, but similar situations happen quite often. And what's with that voice?
I am finished.
Let's just say the acting in the English version is not just underwhelming, it's...
Ну и ну. Кажется, весь поселок собрался.
Чё, все собрались? А теперь тихо. Староста говорить будет.
Люди! Сегодня великий день для нашего поселка. Все мы помним легенду об избранном, который появится в священных развалинах. И вот, смотрите, он среди нас.
Oh dear. Looks like the whole village is here.
Right. Everyone here? Quiet now. The elder is going to speak.
My people, today is a great day for our village. We all remember the legend about the Chosen One who should appear at the sacred ruins. And now, behold, here he is, in the flesh.
Господин капитан, я нашел в лесу тело человека, убитого этой стрелкой. Судя по всему, это тот сыщик из города.
Ага, лесовики нарушили договор, убили человека. Ну, теперь-то у меня будет повод показать этим жабомордиям, кто здесь хозяин. Я такую карательную экспедицию устрою, что о ней заговорят по всему Ингоссу, клянусь честью.
Captain, I found the body of a man in the woods. He was killed with this arrow. It seems to be the snoop from the city.
Ha! The woodsfolk violated the treaty and killed a human. Now I have a reason to show those toad-like creatures who is the boss around here. I will send such a punitive expedition, people will talk about it all around Ingos, on my honor.
It's quite horrible, really. Which is a shame, because the Russian acting is literally perfect. There's not a single unfitting voice, not a single line that was phoned in. And since 99% of all dialogues are subtitled, I would absolutely recommend playing with Russian voices instead, although the best way to achieve that in the GOG version is a bit different than with Rage of Mages. The internal structure of Evil Island's texts.res files differs between language versions. So instead of copying over speech.res from Russian to English like before, it's best to take the English version's texts.res and menus.res and then replace those files in the Russian version. There's one more advantage to having the Russian version as your base, though it's relevant only if you're really into the game. Most mods, plugins and software developed by fans work better with it, as the Russian-speaking community is where they have all been developed. If you install a set of files I linked to in the description, not only will you be able to easily manage mods, but also have native widescreen support for the game, which otherwise would just be stretched 4x3 visuals. Though for the life of me, I couldn't manage to make OBS capture the game when that software was involved, so all I can do is show some widescreen comparison shots. This is also why all game footage in this video is from a 4x3 ratio the game was originally designed for. With all that out of the way, we can finally circle back to the moment that started it all, the main menu. Pressing New Game will prompt a difficulty selection. The easy one got patched in later, so it's obviously not the option closer to my heart. Don't worry about sticking to a single choice though, you can change the difficulty at absolutely any moment, even in the middle of combat. There is no restrictions or penalties in that regard. We then see an impressive cutscene where a mysterious mage summons a tiny dragon to scout the land. The creature finds our main character, Zach, waking up in some sort of ancient ruins. As you know by now, Zach doesn't remember anything, but it just so happens that in the village he finds, there's a prophecy of the Chosen emerging from those same ruins. A person who will protect the village from all the dangers. Plus, Zach is in possession of a metal knife, which in this land of Gepath, where everything is made out of stone, bones and leather, is not just a rarity, it's something pretty much impossible to find. So of course, only the Chosen could have had such a weapon. Zach is not a bad person, but he's also not a hero. He doesn't want to be any sort of messiah, he just wants to find out what has happened to him, but you know, there is a severe punishment if anyone tries to impersonate the Chosen, so he begrudgingly rolls with it. The act of protecting the village while trying to find out who you really are will be done through the game's core tactical stealth strategy systems. Your speed, visibility and sound depend on whether you're running, walking, crouching or crawling. Combat is automatic and essentially represents a series of rolls based on attack and defense stats against either a randomly chosen body part or one you specifically target. Damaging hands and their equivalents lowers attack speed, legs and their equivalent, movement speed, and without a head, no one can live. Hitting the noggin always results in critical damage, although it also requires the most precise targeting during combat, as head rolls are more difficult. It's best to target someone's head while backstabbing them, the success is almost guaranteed that way. You can also cast spells, though it should be noted that stamina they require does not regenerate while you're trying to actively hit someone, but you can always switch your character from aggressive to defensive stance to make sure they don't try to automatically attack any enemies in the vicinity. And if you ever need to take a moment and think about your next action, active pause is just a quick spacebar away. Really? That's all you need to know to play the game successfully? While Evil Islands does have overly long tutorial messages which perhaps are not the best way to teach something, overall it's an easy to learn set of mechanics, particularly for something that sounds as ominous as tactical strategy. Depth comes from the RPG systems and map design, the health and stats of enemies, what attack or spell type they're weak or resistant to, their patrol routes to see if you can backstab them or better avoid them, if there is a mage nearby who goes around casting buffs, and so on. Learning all those specifics is certainly trickier than the core mechanics themselves, although if you just take your time and don't rush into combat at every opportunity, it will be more manageable. Even on easy difficulty, the worst thing you can do when playing Evil Islands is treat it like Diablo. The role-based nature of combat means that even if your defense stat is higher than the attack stat of your opponent, they can still hit your head for critical damage that's potentially deadly. Of course, if you want, you can just abuse the hell out of quick save and quick load. Evil Islands doesn't forbid that. After encountering this, some people say the game is designed around save scamming. I don't agree. The game is designed around your desire to take risks. And if you engage in open combat with an enemy that's on the same power level, a single critical is not going to be enough to kill you outright. But then you might certainly want to damage their hands to decrease the possibility of getting hit in the head, or maybe break their legs so you could more calmly cast some spells from afar, which ignore the defense stats entirely, although the damage will be decreased by the armor value. Of course, this is not to say that there is no unfair omissions. For example, enemies for some reason don't spend stamina neither for running nor casting spells. Also, once they attack, they literally can't lose sight of you. Even if their legs are broken, they will just keep limping towards your current location unless you leave the map outright. And if they get alerted of your presence by a scared unit, guards seem to be able to track you even when you crawl and leave no footprints, which can be unexpected because nobody attempts to track you and get an alert after encountering a dead body. These details are indeed unfair. However, they also don't break the core gameplay loop or make it less enjoyable, and more importantly, don't limit your creative freedom in how you want to tackle the challenges. Most quests in Evil Islands are related to reaching a certain location, obtaining an item, or killing someone. This may seem like a limited amount of verbs, but just in a basic level, there is a big difference whether you need to get an item from a set of islands inhabited by orcs, which are dangerous when fought more than one at a time, and an open forest full of goblins, which at your point of character progression are not menacing at all, unless they pile up into really large groups. That is, if we don't mention things like traps, guard posts, and other map design specifics. Outside of a couple exceptions, quests are designed with the freedom of approach in mind. It's an aspect very important to Evil Islands that is woven throughout all its systems. And quite honestly, sometimes it feels like this approach is a bit misunderstood even by fans, which does actually include myself back in the day. For example, the RPG progression. Your character has certain preset attributes, but other than that, you're free to upgrade their skills and perks whichever way you want by spending the experience points you receive from kills and quests. In terms of your core skills, everything is relevant, though the use steal skills should be upgraded only in very specific playstyles where you want to try and avoid killing, otherwise there's barely any situation where you would need it. While this retains the freedom of approach aspect, it is still a bit more underwhelming in comparison. I guess the developers just couldn't find a way to make the skill truly useful without actively punishing for not upgrading it, although honestly I think that bypassing key items on interactable objects to complete your goal would do the trick. Now, perks are where it gets interesting. You can take any perk at any time, but because of how the pricing system works, it's better to plan ahead. You see, whenever you purchase a perk, prices for all other ones increase approximately twice, and for the next level of the one you just took, approximately 4 times. It's a bit confusing, especially considering that the base price for every perk is different. This leads to predominant advice where fans would tell you that first you have to purchase the most expensive perks you need and upgrade them to the max, and only then get perks from the lower price tier because otherwise you'll waste XP points. The thing is, this advice is true only if you want to upgrade every perk you take to the highest 3rd level. But coming back to the game and remembering years of experience with it, I don't think that every playstyle necessitates that. In some cases, it's enough to just upgrade perks once or twice. In this situation, it's actually better to take and upgrade to the max cheaper perks first, and then take the 1 or 2 levels of the more expensive one you need. At any rate, I think we can all agree on 2 things. First, never take night vision under any circumstances. It's literally useless. Your heroes have the same sight at night as they do during day. In Evil Islands, only the enemy vision distance is affected by night. Second, the whole math behind the perk system is confusing and unfriendly. It would be much better if every perk would have the same cost and be done with it, or at the very least not have two different multipliers. This way, Evil Islands would be able to keep its freeform approach to character building without the need to do all these weird calculations in your head to make sure you don't hurt yourself in the long run. Another fan-favorite advice that I don't agree with relates to mercenaries. On every island there are people willing to join your team. You can have up to 3 characters in your squad at any time, including Zack. Now, I say whether you play with mercenaries or not is up to you. Again, freedom of approach. I always loved having a team at my side. There's going to be a lot of people though who will say that you shouldn't take mercenaries, besides maybe for just a minute to strip them of all equipment. The reasons sound sensible. Any XP that you get while there's someone else in your team is divided between the characters, and mercenaries are limited to their islands. Before teleporting to the next one, you have to say goodbye to your team. So this is deemed as wasted experience points that you could have spent on Zack instead. Now, I'm gonna tell you straight up, don't listen to this advice. Play solo if you prefer a more stealthy approach focused on one-on-one fights and dividing enemy groups into smaller, more manageable encounters. Play with a team if you like to vary your playstyle between stealth and combat, and when fighting want to engage in larger group fights. Here's the thing. Yes, Evil Islands does have underdeveloped aspects, I've already mentioned several. But if there's one thing Nival was good at, it's math. If you search for my old forum posts, you'll find me being among those who would say that everyone in the team should have received the same amount of XP so it wouldn't go to waste. Now, actually having professional design experience, I see that's absolutely the wrong way to look at the math, and Nival knew what they were doing. The current approach allows for both solo and group playthroughs to have the same relevancy. In terms of pure numbers as it relates to skills and perks, the difference between playing with a team or solo is not of Zack being underleveled or on level, but a question of Zack being on level or a bit over level. But here's the thing, overleveling doesn't make you overpowered unless you really focus on min-maxing to the point of attempting to kill absolutely everyone, including presumably unkillable at certain points of progression enemies that can be killed anyway when switching to easy difficulty, to fight them under certain circumstances and builds. It will still involve a lot of luck, but need you tons of experience points with which you can transform Zack into an actual powerhouse. This method of going through the game is called genocide by the fanbase, and sure, if you want to do that, you definitely got to play solo. Otherwise, as I said, whether you take mercenaries on is just a matter of playstyle. Playing in a team doesn't prevent you from backstabbing to death enemies quite more powerful than you, even on the harder difficulty level. Playing in a team doesn't lead to more saves coming in combat, even though technically every member of your squad is weaker than Zack would have been had he stayed solo. In fact, in my experience, it leads to less saves coming. Now imagine if everyone in the group would receive the same amount of XP, the Merc playstyle would just crush so many challenges without even breaking a sweat and rob of any possible strategic choices. Because the other aspect that the advice against mercenaries ignores is that of probability. If your defense stat is higher than the offense stat of the enemy, yes, it decreases the chances of them hitting you, but unless the difference is really big, it doesn't make you immune to them. Every time someone strikes, there's a roll, and the more enemies you face, the more the odds are stacked up against you, even if you are technically stronger than all of them, because you can make only one action at a time anyway. With a team, you can make 2 or 3 actions at a time against a single or multiple opponents, while spreading the enemy's attention across more heroes than just the one. Which also means that in a combat scenario you can take care of a group of enemies far more efficiently than if you attempt to participate in the same scenario solo while hogging all the XP. This is why I say your choice of having companions or not should depend on your playstyle, because even if you play as only Zack, there's only so much batteries can do when fighting multiple opponents at once. Wait, batteries? Yeah, that's a nickname for a wand holding a healing spell with a continuous cast rune, so as soon as you're damaged you also get heals, But hey, items have stamina too, in their case called energy, so it's not unlimited but still quite effective. This is just one of the many ways you can be creative with the crafting system in Evil Islands. Every item consists of two parts, the prototype and materials. Quality and stats of the resulting item depend on both. Every spell also consists of two parts, the spell base, also known as keystone, and runes, which adjust the variables of the spell at the cost of skill complexity and stamina usage. And finally, you can combine items and spells together. Now, I think it is obvious how a system like this can feel exceptionally liberating. The potential is, quite frankly, unlimited. That being said, as amazing as the system itself is, in the end its implementation is something that's not fully fleshed out. First, in terms of item prototypes and materials that are built out of, there's not enough side grades. Sure, there are some things like mithril being the lightest of metals, but for the most part, if you're building metal items, the only thing you need to worry about is that they're weak to lightning magic. But if you do build a metal item, you just want to utilize the best metal material available, which to be fair usually can only be taken from enemies and can't be bought in stores. But you won't have to make choices between a metal that does a lot of damage but doesn't hold a lot of magic and vice versa, a prototype that's really heavy but durable, or one that's lighter but doesn't protect as much. While materials do have different weights, all item prototypes of one category share the same base value. And if in an island like Gipath, where you're still learning the ropes, this linear progression approach is fine, once you get to Ingus and Suslanger, it starts feeling a bit limited. Which leads to the second, somewhat disappointing aspect of the item balance. The materials and item prototypes are very stingy with their spell complexity and energy stats. As a result, combination of items and spells, even in the form of wands, perform mostly a support role. Sure, you can make an axe that weakens the opponent or hits them with lightning, but even if you have the money and magic skills to construct a paralysis spell of a couple seconds, yeah, it's pretty much impossible to put it in any item. Don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean that the amount of possibilities is small, far from that. It's big, but it's just not as insanely big as would have been preferable given the potential depth of the entire system. But I guess, in a way, that's the price of innovation. The question is, how willing are you to accept gameplay and content of high quality, even if it doesn't reach the fullest possible potential? I've been listing all advantages of Evil Island's gameplay and systems straight alongside aspects that aren't quite there, and if we're absolutely fair, I could list more. From how Evil Islands never explains that if you sell an item or a rune to a store, then after you complete a quest, that item will now be multiplied and regularly sold, with the exception of materials, to how the game lacks a proper diplomacy settings, so even allied to you units on maps won't help fight enemies even if they get accidentally hit by them, all the way to how on the last zones of the third island, quest design becomes more rigid. An alarm gets sound even if you sneak past guards of a certain gate unnoticed, and there's a specific set of traps that's impossible to disable without luring a guard with a firework spell. And if you don't have it in person, well, you gotta hop back to the base to get it. And by the way, the funniest story. When writing the script, I wanted to make sure I'm not wrong about that last part, and I decided to Google if it's indeed not possible to complete that quest without the firework spell. And I found a forum post answering the question that yeah, it's not possible. And the person who wrote it was me, from 2010. Current me googled a question that past me answered to myself. How wild is that? Anyway, the point is, if you're going to search for flaws in Evil Islands, you will find them. But Evil Islands is greater than the sum of its parts. It's not just strictly about numbers and stats. It's how you're scared shitless of skeletons guarding a treasure because they can't be backstabbed and sense you from far away. It's trying to figure out what the hell is making those weird sounds in the caves. It's laughing at a pack of puny rats until a Cthulhu-like creature puts a bunch of haste spells on them, leading to your quick death. It's the feeling of defeating your first ever troll because for half of the game these were always enemies to avoid, but now, finally, you can deal with them as equals. By the way, Evil Islands contextualizes the power level of every enemy type very elegantly. For example, it makes sense why human enemies become stronger. At first you're dealing with people who essentially live in the Stone Age, then with more properly equipped rebellious civilians and city guards, and at the end it's a full-on professional army. Hyenas on Suslanger are approximately the same power as wolves on Kipath, which makes sense. And sure, this means that by the time you're on Suslanger you barely recognize them as enemies, but that also gives you a sense of progress. The common wild creature of your level to deal with in turn are gonna be giant spiders, and it makes sense why those creepy crawlies would be stronger than any tiger and boar you've encountered before. And the design of creatures is really memorable. Some, like the overgrown teenage mutant ninja trolls, are taken pretty much directly from Allods. Others, like the ogres, are more so inspired by the old designs to make it seem like in different regions these creatures would not look the same. Sadly, there's no squirrels, but there's dryads who look like little aliens. It all gives the world a certain personality and feeds into world building. Sure, the enemy placement on Suslanger is somewhat haphazard, but also it feels really dangerous, which is perfectly in line with it being a backwater province of the Kadaganian Empire, a name certainly familiar to the fans of Allods. Nival has put in the work to really enrich the lore from all sides, though it did lead to some stylistic changes. Kadagan became a much more totalitarian entity, a land of strict hierarchy where not following the law leads to death. It's certainly a big contrast from how Yazas has been depicted in Rage of Mages 2, but it also gives the Empire a particular sense of identity, especially when contrasted with the Empire of Kanya, which we finally can see for ourselves in the form of Ingos. And it might feel like a fair democratic country, except it's corrupt to the very core. The governor is lazy and cares only about his well-being, fair trade is impossible because of a monopolistic bully, taxes are so huge the citizens are in pretty much open rebellion that the city guards don't care about controlling unless they get direct orders. And of course there's Gipath, which is just a land forgotten by everyone, but also it's the one that feels the most like home. What I find really charming about Evil Islands is that while it doesn't try to depict the world or various types of government as just, and there's a lot of dangers on every corner, it also doesn't go to the extreme of just being a collection of undesirable crapsick places that no one in their right mind would want to live in. It's romantic, in a way. And I think there's something to be said about the atmosphere when even the most despicable of humans is not going to swear your ears out with curse words. Very often fantasy worlds go all the way towards either heroic type of world building or extremely realistic one full of the worst kinds of things you would be able to find on our very own Earth. Evil Islands, on the other hand, is an elegant and interesting mix of the two approaches, and quite honestly, like with the game's mechanics, you don't see that kind of thing often. And the main character himself represents that principle. Zack is not averse to killing, especially when under player's control, but also he is going to wonder why every good deed has to end up with him stabbing someone with a pointy stick. He has a strong sense of justice, but at the same time is more than willing to resort to blackmail to achieve his goals.
А я не спрашивать пришел, а сказочку рассказать.
Ты что, милейший, спятил? Я деловой человек, у меня каждая минута на счету. Какие сказки? И впрямь грибочков объелся.
Послушай, моя сказка не длинная. Жил-был один торговец. Всем хорош. Да дела нечестно вел, губернатора обманывал. Долго ли, коротко ли, но в один прекрасный день...
Не понимаю я, юноша, какие такие обманы?
В один прекрасный день пропали у него бумаги важные. Отчеты бухгалтерские, если попросту. А там про махинации торговые все записано.
И что?
Приходит к торговцу человек и говорит: «Хочешь бумаги назад? Расскажи мне кое-что». Торговец был глупый и не поверил. В тот же день бумаги попали к губернатору.
Интересная байка. А там только про торговца было? Ты про того человечка припомни, он на здоровье не жаловался? А то времена неспокойные, всякое случиться может.
По-разному рассказать можно. Есть печальная сказочка. С тем человеком и впрямь беда приключилась, а бумаги все одно к губернатору попали. Не так глуп человек был, чтобы бумаги с собой таскать.
Zack is larger than life and yet also so human and grounded, which makes him very relatable just like the people in the world around him. We can't talk about the game's atmosphere without discussing the music. In the beginning of the video I gave you a little taste of it, but now I'm just going to let it speak for itself alongside the very solid sound design.
Хорошо.
Понятно.
Хорошо.
Понял.
Понял. Понял. Так не получится.
Стареть надо, устаю быстро. Приказ понятен.
Я не могу больше держать.
Хорошо.
Нет ничего. Я люблю это искусство. Мне нужен.
Сраны. Увы, мои силы истощились.
Вот
The cherry on top is the story. I've already mentioned a couple times just how amazing the game's writing and voice acting is in the Russian version. Sadly, if you don't speak Russian, you won't be able to experience that fully, but at least you can still play with the Russian voices for a better representation of personalities and emotions. And hopefully that way you'll be able to at least appreciate the narrative itself, which does start with your standard for video games amnesia, but it gets oh so much more elaborate. You see, one other thing that makes Evil Islands unique is that its plot is actually of the detective genre. On every island, there is one or two big mysteries that you have to solve, all of which are connected to the central one regarding your memory. This is why I'm trying not to show a lot of conversations or characters even though I really want to, because honestly I think you're in for some great surprises if you haven't experienced the tale already. Let's just say the narrative is full of Chekhov's guns, both big and small. And those hints are accompanied by characters so great that when the gun actually gets metaphorically fired, you remember those situations and connect everything together. So let's say when in search of a portal out of Gipath, you lure the goblin chieftain Gogo to your village because he has a blue stone in his eye out of which it is said portal contraptions were made. There's more to that than just a quirky and fun character conversation.
Не мочь моя шкура нести. Как первый гоблин пропал, моя ходил орка просить, помогать вернуть. А орка меня на лысый остров заводить и побить сильно. Они сказать, ты Гого теперь, и слово какое-то нехорошее, моя забыть. А потом орка деньги отнимать, скоро буквы отнимать, в сундук ложить, а меня пинать и прогонять. Бедный Гого, несчастный Гого, был вождя стать этот, который слово нехороший.
The elder and craftsmen of the Gipath village constantly bickering between one another, finding a dryad arrow in a dead body in the forests of Ingos, and a seemingly innocuous introduction to one of the brothers from the last shelter on Suslanger, all those and more matter. And perhaps some of the core concepts of the narrative aren't anything new, but everything takes such a well-formed shape that it's just not possible to not enjoy or not be intrigued by the story. Which is something that can be applied to the entire game, really. Even for its time, a lot of mechanics or elements used in Evil Islands weren't something particularly new on their own. But there was no other game that combined them all together in such a particular manner, with a high-quality implementation to boot. And maybe I'm wrong here, but I don't think that at the moment of writing this, there's many other newer titles that attempt to do the combination of elements that Evil Islands does. It defies explanation in a way, doesn't fit any standard definition. I suppose, taking all those factors into account, it's no wonder that in Russian-speaking countries the reception of Evil Islands was nothing less than legendary. And not just because in the end it turned out to be a really high-quality game even considering its flaws, but also because it proved that the evolving industry in the region doesn't have to play catch-up. It can innovate and set the rules. Now, you might wonder, what about all the issues I've mentioned? Were they just ignored? I mean, the most obvious ones, no. But the thing is, a lot of problems that I pointed out are really noticeable only on the second playthrough. So I suppose the funny thing about calling Evil Island's production rushed towards the end is that it hides that very well. For example, I've mentioned that Suslanger has only 16 story quests in comparison to Gepath's 43. And even though that does speed up the pacing of the story considerably, all the important plot bits are hit. So you look at Suslanger's arc and you can't say that something's missing for the story to not be whole. It's just that some characters don't gain as much depth as it would be preferable, but they're still memorable. Same applies to map design, for example. This is Gepath's Foothills map. The way Evil Island's map design works is that every area is essentially dedicated to a particular quest. In the case of Foothills, the separation would look like this. Practically every inch of the map is somehow utilized. Then let's say we take the City of Suslanger map, and we'll see that, hey, okay, it's a bit more patchy, but it's also utilized almost to its full extent. There's nothing to create an evident feeling of not having enough content on Suslanger, not even the balance. Remember I said that Nival is good at math? Well, it don't feel like Suslanger suddenly has an insane difficulty spike or anything like that, like it needs more zones or quests or enemies to fight. It's all very smooth. So even though Evil Islands still has aspects to flesh out, it was also very polished, if that makes sense. You would get positive impressions anyway. Which is why I suppose it's not that surprising that the game's German release at the same time as the Russian version was met with a quite positive reception too. But in Poland, which saw the title in the first half of 2001, it was an outright hit. In fact, sometimes it felt that at any point in time there were more active Polish players than there were Russian-speaking ones, and that's considering people playing the Russian version would come from multiple post-Soviet countries. But of course, given the history with Rage of Mages, the real test would be the reception of the English version, which had its release in 2001 too, as it's the related outlets that would define what can be considered the global international response to the game. And it was good. Very good. Great even. Both critics and players alike enjoyed the game a lot. It got Editor's Choice label from IGN, was nominated in a bunch of RPG of the Year side awards, although sadly didn't win a single one, but still! The most common criticisms include voice acting, which...
I am finished!
Yeah, obviously. Writing, and I do agree that in the English version it tends to be more informational and loses some of the flavor and personality from the original, and the last big contested point, difficulty. Even with the easy mode patched in, the game was considered too hard, but also I noted that feedback mostly came from outlets that would consider Evil Islands to be closer to the hack and slash genre, and I did say that's the worst way to approach the game. All in all though, after Rage of Mages failed twice to capture the attention of global audiences, I can safely say that the third time is indeed the charm. And even though the English version didn't become an absolute breakout, wonder why?
I woke up and could not remember anything.
Yeah, we'll never let that down. I really don't believe that this first line sets expectations the right way. Still, Evil Islands could be considered a global success. At the time though, I didn't really pay much attention to that kind of stuff. I would just enjoy replaying the single-player campaign on a regular basis, as well as playing the multiplayer mode with the online community. So many hours spent online, so many fun memories. I'm glad that a number of screenshots have survived all this time and I can show them here for nostalgic reasons. Multiplayer of Evil Islands mechanically was pretty much the same as single player, it's just you always controlled only your generated character and the team size maximum could be 6 people instead of 3. In terms of balance though, it did feel like it's another aspect where the developers had to hurry, because at times it could feel particularly punishing, although ultimately there was nothing you couldn't beat with a well-rounded team of players. People would also attempt to find various styles of completing the single-player campaign. One of them I already mentioned, it was nicknamed Genocide, a way to kill absolutely everyone, including presumably unkillable enemies, which involves breaking a lot of quest logic. As a sort of response to that, another walkthrough style was coined, Redemption, which focused on completing the entire game without killing anyone. Well, directly at least. And actually, I myself managed to coin a sort of speedrunish playthrough style called Marathon. It wasn't a speedrun in the modern, traditional meaning of reaching the end of the game as fast as possible in real time, though by now Evil Island's community has that as well, but focused on reaching the end of the game in as few in-game days as possible. I did so in 10 in-game days, though since then there are people who have done that faster. All this is to say that the community surrounding Evil Islands was really active, and this being a PC game of course would mean that people wanted to make mods. This was propagated even further by Nival sharing some tools for creating new quests or changing balance in the multiplayer mode. Of course, any of the more advanced toolsets would stay behind closed doors, so fans in turn would start writing their own software and forming various teams or groups to do mods and new quests mostly for multiplayer. Meanwhile, on a personal level, this would be an era when I'd decide that I want to become a game developer and start researching various aspects, like what is game design in the first place, for example. That's how I discovered GameDeveloper.com, at the time called Gamasutra. I would print out articles from there to read them separately because we couldn't keep our modem turned on 24/7 like we usually do with routers nowadays. One time, my mom asked what I was reading and I told her Gamasutra. And she was like, "You're reading what now?" Took a closer look at my printed out pages, saw that it's not what she thought she heard, and just didn't mention it ever again. At the time, I was still 9 years old, close to turning 10, so I didn't get what she was shocked about until years later. All I can say is, the site name change is definitely for the best. While I was doing all this research, somewhere around 2002 a group of fans named Gepard Group gathered together and they wanted to make an unofficial expansion pack to the game that in early 2003 would get the subtitle Spring on Gigran, starting active development. You would play as the former leader of the Necromancer Guild Fazil, as he would get betrayed by his nemesis Firez and sent to Suslanger, where he would meet his new companion Helm, with whom they would try to get back to Gigran, a land of eternal autumn. During the journey through the old islands as well as the new one, Fazil would gain a new outlook on life, which in the end would result not only in defeating Firez, but also in breaking the curse of eternal autumn. Spring would finally come to Gigran. I found out about this team around 2004 because in parallel they were making one of the most popular at the time's mods for multiplayer, called simply EI Mod. And then I saw they were also working on the expansion, so of course I got immediately interested and would try to find my way to not just join their community, but the team as well. Now, what I didn't know at the time is that Gepard Group had a bunch of internal disagreements and half of it left. They had an agreement, the ones who leave take with them the quests and missions that were already done, but the concept of the story with Fazil and Helm would stay at Gepard Group. Gigran as a name and idea of an island with eternal autumn could be used by both. The team that left formed a company called Matilda Entertainment, finished up the add-on and then got in contact with Nival for some support with voice acting, marketing, as well as an official release in 2006 in the form of a standalone expansion titled Evil Islands Lost in Astral. Incidentally, this would be the first project Nival would release in the role of a publisher. Yes, by 2006 the company's importance in the local industry would only keep increasing, and it was pretty symbolic that the first game they published related to Evil Islands. This add-on didn't get any official localizations, however there is a fan translation to English which I will link to in the description if you're interested. It should be noted that it takes machine translation as a base, so prepare for statements that have the exact opposite meaning from the original, because machines don't understand sarcasm, or just some nonsense because let's say under the sun sounds really close to what can mean sunflower, even though the original sentence is about being worked to death. Still, you will get what the overall story is about, I suppose, plus, honestly, it doesn't make much sense anyway. Here's the thing. When Matilda left with all the content that was done for Suslanger and Gepath, they had to redo the storyline while keeping the same mission design. So very often you just can't help but think how the hell does this chain of events make sense, but hey, it all was meant for a different story altogether. Ingos and Gigran fare better, but honestly, by the point you reach them, the damage has already been done, plus they have their own fair share of weirdness. But what is a bigger problem for me though is the fact that Lost in Astral follows what for some reason has been a pretty big trend with all manner of fan works based on Evil Islands. And that is, instead of expanding and bettering the freeform approach at the core of the original game, arbitrarily restrict it instead. And look, back in the day, and maybe because I would live in the same fan ecosystem, I really enjoyed Lost in Astral. Actually, thanks to this game, I won a competition held by Nival, where it was required to write a creative walkthrough for one of the game's missions, and the prize was a big box version of the original Evil Islands. Considering I had only the budget jewel case before, I was beyond happy. But revisiting Lost in Astral now, I couldn't help but feel constantly frustrated. It took all the wrong lessons from Evil Islands. Instead of trying to fix the weird math and some bugs of the perk system to make fully freeform build creation possible without overplanning everything, you have to choose one of 3 classes for your 2 main characters, with available perks being restricted by what class you chose. While there has been some pretty neat ways to rebalance existing items, overall, instead of expanding the potential of the crafting system, Lost in Astral limits it instead. Some spells have complexities so high it's impossible to place them in any items. The continuous costing is removed altogether, so you couldn't have batteries. The only item-related rune you can add is the one that activates on hitting or being hit, but even then the spells you can put in are limited because of the complexity-value balance. But most egregious is the mission design. In an attempt to become more varied, Lost in Astral keeps placing limits all over the place. Escort missions where you don't control the character you have to follow and you lose if they die, and considering how they just don't stop and keep attacking every enemy they get close to, they will die often. Stealth missions where you lose not only if you get noticed, but if you leave jail cells open. Missions which you can complete only with stealth, missions that you can complete only with combat. It all was done in the name of variety. For example, combat missions can lead to some pretty massive battles, but all these quests taken together lack a gameplay choice and agency in comparison to the original. The balance doesn't help. Not only is it really difficult to keep up with the attack defense stats of enemies, but their armor absorption stats are just so huge. Of course, you can always turn on the easy difficulty, but the thing is, it decreases the stats of non-playable allies too. And considering that there are plenty of missions where you have companions that have to survive or armies that assist you, turning easy mode on in these instances only makes it worse for yourself. And all this just leads to an experience that's impossible to complete without save scumming. I would do more in just an hour of playing Lost in Astral than the entirety of the original Evil Islands. It's not like Lost in Astral doesn't have great or original ideas, but there is something that keeps putting them into a rigid framework anyway. The game introduces secret missions. If you complete all of them, you'll get a second ending, and you can always find a character that hints at those missions. Sounds great! The problem? Those missions can't be completed until you get the respective hint, even if you notice something while exploring. Lost in Astral tries to make the use steal skill more meaningful by adding optional objects on maps that require investment into the skill, but in exchange give monetary rewards and some experience. Again, interesting idea, but the result is sort of an enclosed ecosystem where you upgrade the use steal skill to get experience points to upgrade the skill more, while hurting the combat-related progression of your character. The monetary rewards you get don't matter that much, and everything related to actual quests can be completed without the use steal skill. The game tries to make the design of enemies more varied, even including some fun archetypes like zombie deer and exploding undead bunnies, but also you just get a lot of cheap deaths because very often enemies have higher sight value than you. Have fun walking around and then getting killed by a suddenly appearing dragon. The flow of quests is once again very rigid. In Evil Islands, most of the time you would have several quests you could complete at once, and they always had pretty smart placements. Plus, the game would turn on the possibility to fast travel through previously often visited zones at the exactly right moments. In Lost in Astral, most of the time you have just one active quest. They're sort of spread haphazardly throughout the islands, even new ones like Gigran, and the game is really stingy with turning on fast travel for existing zones, so in the end you'll have to go through a lot of back and forth on the same areas over and over again. It gets tiring. Lost in Astral tries to do some graphical updates to the game, specifically in the area of character models, but they just look big-nosed and weird with stretched-out mouths and sort of silly haircuts. But if there's one thing that's undeniably amazing in Lost in Astral, then it's Jigran. The island is beautiful, and the new tracks are as majestic as the ones from the original game. I suppose it helps that the composer was the same.
Опять идти.
Не заблужусь.
С удовольствием.
Понятно. Конечно. Иди туда и сюда. Надоело. Иди туда и сюда. Надоело. Конечно.
Надеюсь,
Don't get me wrong though, just because I am frustrated by the game and don't agree with a lot of its decisions doesn't mean I criticize people from Matilda. Rule number 1 of every video game discussion: we're talking about the final product, not the people who made it. I actually have nothing but the highest respect for the fans that pushed Lost in Astral out of the door because they released a game. I know that from a consumer standpoint that doesn't really matter that much. All players should care about is the final quality, which in the case of Lost in Astral can be called questionable. It has certainly been somewhat of a divisive game both among players and critics. But game development is such a mess that just actually finishing a project and getting it out there is an achievement. Any game, be it good, bad or a mixed bag, is a miracle. And I would know, because my first real experience of the kind would be utterly failing at that miracle, though while having tons of fun and becoming much wiser. After the Gibat group split in 2004, the people that remained started searching for new blood, and I got in. At first I would work on quests for the multiplayer EI mod, but after a while I would get onto the main Spring on Jigran project wearing a lot of hats. Technically, I was responsible for writing the story and dialogues, but I also did a lot of scripting for quests, world events, various scenes and dialogue zones to add more life to them, and so on. We all were multidisciplined. While my days were busy with school and dancing, I still was making sure to make some progress on the project every day, and this continued for 3 years. Now, actually looking back at some stuff that we did, which I can't get to record because like with widescreen the required mod software doesn't let me for some reason, so I'm just going to show screenshots we released for the project, I think Spring on Jigran did a lot of mistakes that are similar to Lost in Astral. Either misunderstanding Evil Islands and its possibilities, or trying to fit some concepts that really don't fit. Heck, even one of the first quests involves examining an area which the narrative says you can't escape, even though in terms of actual gameplay design you totally would be able to. And we were really over-scripting various quests, adding what can be called variety, but also making everything more rigid and easier to break. But hey, we had a dream. And now I realize it was an unattainable dream. Perhaps it's ironic, considering that in the concept of the story, the Spring on Jigran was fittingly considered an unattainable dream as well. But we wanted to make it the best possible fan project one could ever want. So we had tons of ideas that we kept adding for quests, storylines, non-linear events. It got to the point that just the first island, Susanger, was planned to have about 100 quests, but depending on your playthrough you'd see only around 30 of them. And we'd do that for every island. For comparison, the original Evil Islands had around 80 quests in total. The scope was insane for a team of enthusiasts, and this scope just kept blowing up. Our builds would get more broken as we'd go on, as there would be more and more of work in progress and finished stuff. We thought we would release the game in modules, episodically so to speak, but each module was becoming pretty huge, so it's not like that decision did any good. By late 2007, various team members would fall off the project, and it felt like we were only putting the finish line farther away from us. So me and one other team member, Algeron, spent a month working on a detailed proposal of a much smaller scoped version of the project. The story was based on the same concept, but fully rewritten. We wanted to make sure we have complete character arcs and avoid adding more and more stuff to it. Each of the 4 islands would be limited to around 20-25 quests. We also wanted to return to the more freeform direction of Evil Islands, because that would make it easier to actually make quests, as we'd need to do less specific and unique scripting for each one. But when we presented it to the remaining team, many weren't too keen on it. It was too far from such an exciting dream we had before. But everyone understood that, yeah, Spring Energy Grand scope is too big. So we agreed to freeze the project and make a much smaller expansion to, well, finish something, and hopefully that way find new people who would be interested to assist with the big expansion. We decided to make a prequel focused on the Dead City on Gipath, how it actually turned into Dead City. But the thing is, nobody was too excited for it because it wasn't what people wanted to do. So that mod died very quickly after barely getting started. And so that was the end of Gibat Group, really. It never officially disbanded or anything, but we also weren't really doing any projects anymore. But look, Sagrer, Sniper, Alex, Algeron, MX, Evil Alpha, Kalbaska, Grad, and everyone else I forgot to mention. Those years, from 2004 to 2008, I had the time of my life, and I wouldn't really have it any other way. We may not have finished Spring on Gigran, but nothing will replace the fun we had doing it and the experience that I, and I'm sure everyone else, has received. So what happened to the Evil Islands community after? Well, actually got into a sort of state of hibernation for some time. It is in those years I would join the VFS game design program in Canada and move away from Moldova for a while, and then, well, then it would be the official start of my career. And I didn't have a lot of time to actively participate in the Evil Islands modding community, which actually at some point would start getting a big resurgence. Now there's actually far more multiplayer mods than there has ever been. There's no full-fledged expansions in the works, but there are some smaller story mods and a bunch of single-player mods that do updates for the main campaign. Some of them seem to be pretty popular, and some managed to make engine changes and additions others could only dream of back in the day, like adding shields, which back in the early 2000s was an unachievable pipe dream. From the things I checked, some of these single-player and multiplayer fan projects, despite very impressive additions, still try to put Evil Islands in some more arbitrarily limited boxes like we did back in the day. For example, many mods still try to push for classes or something similar in an inherently classless system, and I don't agree with this approach anymore, but look. As long as the mod creators and the community playing them are having fun, what I think doesn't really matter. Though multiplayer is not as active as it once was, that's largely because official master servers were shut down and you can only play online through a special fan plugin. That's why it's pretty difficult to find someone randomly hanging around. Most of the time to get a game going you have to arrange it, but it's still definitely possible to play online with other people if you so desire. I think the reason why people started floating back to Evil Islands is because even now, more than 20 years after its release, there is no game that's quite like it, flaws and all. If you want an experience like Evil Islands, you sort of have to get back to Evil Islands. Granted, the game's resurgence seems to be happening mostly among Russian-speaking players who still remember it very often and fondly. Internationally, sure, Evil Islands is on GOG, but despite the positive reception on launch, nowadays it's this niche, mostly forgotten RPG.
I am finished!
Yeah, and this is a big reason why nobody wants to remember that. So, if this video has made you want to try Evil Islands out, make sure to play it with Russian voice acting even if you don't speak it at all. It's just going to be a far better experience. And then, who knows, maybe you'll get invested enough to see what the community has to offer. Because otherwise there is nowhere else you can turn if you want to find more of Evil Islands. Which can lead to a very reasonable question. What happened to the universe after this game besides the standalone expansion? Allods was a franchise that 3 years in a row was essentially banger after banger, at least locally. Surely we'd see something. Well, 2005 was a pretty big year in a way. There was a port of Rage of Mages 2 for Pocket PC, a Age of Mages prequel for mobile phones made in Java, as well as the final release of a whole fan project sequel to Age of Mages 2 in the form of a mod for Dungeon Siege called Legends of Allods. But talking about these would be outside the scope of this video. Still, while all these are nice projects, it's not the next big thing, right? Did the universe just die? Well, technically, no. But let's just say that in the end, many old fans that were indeed excited for the next big step in the universe of Allods and Evil Islands didn't feel they were the target audience for the sad next big step after it got released. But that's a tale for another time.